Welcome back to part 4 of our series on Laci Peterson. At the end of our last episode, we uncovered some scandalous secrets from Jackie Peterson's past and explored the dark history in the family that might have led to their birth a lifetime before. If you haven't watched the previous episodes in the series, get caught up before watching further so you don't miss any of the shocking details or find this episode hard to follow. We've linked all 3 parts in the description. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to get notified when we post new episodes, if you like the content. Thanks for listening, let's get started. In our last episode, we also introduced Scott's siblings, both those from his father Lee's previous marriage, which include Susan, Joe, and Mark, who are all significantly older than Scott. As well as Jackie's son John, who is 6 years older than Scott, from a previous relationship. John, as far as anyone other than Jackie knew, was Scott's only other sibling from his mother. John was named for Jackie's murdered father, whose killer would coincidentally serve out his sentence in San Quentin State Prison. But we also introduced 2 additional children that Jackie Peterson placed for adoption over 3 decades earlier, when she was still Jackie Latham. Her first baby, Don Chapman, was born in April of 1963 and ended up working for the airline industry, somewhere out east. He had a wife and 3 children, but otherwise no family to speak of, after his estrangement from his adopted sister, and the death of both of his adoptive parents. Jackie's second baby was a girl, born in July of 1965. Her adoptive parents, Geraldine, who went by Jerry, and Thomas Grady, named the little girl, Anne. Anne Grady and her parents still lived in California. She'd worked jobs in public relations as well as investment banking, but most recently, Anne was divorced and working for her father, in San Diego, not far from where Jackie and Lee Peterson raised the 2 children she kept. Scott Peterson, who she shared with her husband Lee, and John, who kept the Latham name and who was nearly placed for adoption after his birth as well. Born just a year after Anne was adopted to the Gradys, in July of 1966, it was Jackie's doctor who convinced her to keep John and raise him herself. Now, 30 years after Jackie placed him for adoption, Don Chapman wanted to learn about his birth mother. Don also wanted to know more about his little sister, in San Diego. He contacted Jackie first, and after a pleasant reunion, and a warm welcome from Jackie's family, that included a wedding invite from Laci, Don decided to call his sister. Don's phone call took Anne's breath away, and Don could tell even over the phone that what he was telling her was a lot for her to take in. Anne had known for most of her life that she was adopted, but she had no idea that she had a brother. And once he began to tell her about Jackie and mention a possible meeting, she was nearly overwhelmed. Don reassured her that there would be no pressure from him, or anyone else, to meet Jackie or even himself, if she didn't wish to or wasn't ready. He told her the decision was entirely hers, with no judgment, whichever way she decided. Don also let her know she could take her time considering her decision, and that he understood the gravity of everything he'd just laid in her hands. Anne went to her adopted mother Jerry for more information and for her advice. Since Don's phone call, Anne's curiosity about Jackie and the rest of her family had been steadily building. She'd never given much thought to her birth mother. Never really interested to know who or where Jackie was, but with this phone call and the news of a brother she'd never imagined existed, she'd begun to wonder about 1,000 different things. From superficial things like wondering if she looked like Jackie, did she have the same hair color, or the same color eyes, to far more sensitive questions about the circumstances that caused her mother to give her up, how Don fit into the story, and if she had other siblings somewhere. She thought her adoptive mother might know more about Jackie Latham, but Anne's mom, Jerry, didn't have much detail to give. She said they'd never actually met Jackie, so their communication before they adopted Anne must have been through a third party. Because we know that Jackie was concerned for her baby girl going with the Gradys initially, because Jackie learned that Jerry had cancer at the time. But they never met in person, so Jerry couldn't even tell Anne if she resembled her real mother or shared any of her features. Anne did learn that Jackie had great legs, or at least her uncle thought she did. It was Anne's aunt and uncle who picked her up from Jackie at the hospital and brought her home to the Gradys. Apparently, the thing that stuck out most for her uncle was Jackie's great pair of legs. Anne doesn't elaborate on whether she inherited Jackie's great gams or not, but she does begin to realize that she'll have to dig much deeper to get the answers to the new questions racing through her mind. Anne's adoptive mother Jerry was enthusiastic for Anne to learn what she could about her birth mother and her other children. While Anne was a bit unsure about jumping into a relationship with Jackie Latham Peterson, or the other siblings born to her, her mother, Jerry, encouraged Anne to at least meet them. Jerry's simple reasoning still stuck with Anne years later. She can remember her asking, "What's the worst that could happen?" As Anne Grady drove up the coast with her newly found brother Don to meet Jackie, Lee, Scott, and soon-to-be Lacey Peterson, she couldn't have imagined what would happen after. Anne Grady soon found herself on the phone with Jackie Peterson. She could hear Jackie pacing nervously through the receiver while they spoke. Their first conversation was a little strained and a little strange. Jackie wanted to know what she looked like. Anne described herself as petite and shapely. Then, Jackie asked her about her eyes. She wanted to know the color, but then she asked if she had the kind of eyelids you could put makeup on. Anne thought the question was strange, but she answered that yes, she did. Then Jackie told her,
"All the Lathams have nice eyes."
And then Jackie went on to say, "You know, I've always thought about you." And Anne thinks she will continue with something significant, an explanation for why she gave her up, or give some insight into her life, or the adoption, or her feelings about their reunion, but there's only awkward silence after. Jackie finally just tells her that she hopes to get to meet her soon, and not to be shy about calling. The two spoke on the phone twice more, but their conversations were stilted, awkward, and had no depth. They spoke about the weather, Anne's taste in clothes, and her career, but they never dug any deeper than the surface over the phone. Then, in July, Don called and told Anne that he was planning a trip to San Diego, and wanted to know if she would like to make the drive with him up the coast, to meet Jackie. Anne thought this might be a better opportunity to get Jackie to open up and give some understanding of her past. After all, she couldn't really expect much depth to come from a couple of phone calls. She accepted Don's invitation to go meet Jackie in person. She met Don at the airport, and after she and her adoptive parents, Jerry and Thomas, treated him to dinner, and hosted him overnight at their home in Point Loma, they all instantly liked Don. She grew to like Don even more, over the hour or so they'd spent driving to the Shell Beach Motel in La Jolla, where Jackie and Lee were staying. Though Jackie and Lee were still living in Morro Bay at the time, they'd driven about 5 hours down the coast, to their old stomping grounds in La Jolla, to meet with Don and Anne. He told her she had a movie star smile, just like Jackie's. Then, he made a bit of a joke, saying he hadn't gotten so lucky to inherit Jackie's beautiful smile, and that's why he'd grown a mustache. Don tried to keep the mood light on their drive, but she couldn't help but ask him, "What did he call Jackie?" Don said he'd been calling Jackie Mom since the moment they met. But Anne couldn't envision calling Jackie Peterson Mom as they got closer to their first meeting, and she never did seem to warm up to the idea. The topic then turned to Jackie's poor health. Jackie was on oxygen, and she was limited in her physical activities, because her lungs were in such poor condition. It wasn't emphysema, and Jackie had never been a smoker, but her lungs had been battered and scarred from the multiple bouts of pneumonia she'd developed in the Nazareth House orphanage as a child. Don told her he had already been made aware that Jackie's health was so poor, the Petersons weren't sure just how long Jackie had left to live. When Don and Anne reached Jackie and Lee's room at the Shell Beach Motel, Don told her not to be nervous, and reassured her that Jackie would adore her. Anne hadn't been nervous really, at least not until he'd said that. Now, she wondered if she had something to be nervous about. But as he raised his hand to knock on the door, she quickly shoved those feelings down, and introduced herself to her birth mother, for the first time. Jackie was hooked up to a small oxygen tank, but it didn't seem to embarrass her or make her look frail or sickly. And the tubes over her ears, running to her nose, hadn't detracted from her beauty either. Jackie embraced Anne in a hug right away. Jackie said she'd been anxious about meeting her daughter for the first time, and she'd been doing a breathing treatment as they knocked. But she hadn't seemed anxious, not at all in fact. Jackie began to ask very specific questions, soon after they took their seats on the couch together. She wanted to know whether she liked mushrooms, or colorful clothes, what her sleeping patterns were like, and what she preferred to read. Perhaps Jackie was searching for like habits, or family traits she might have passed down to her. Anne was happy to answer her questions, but as they continued to talk for a while, she was a bit disappointed in Jackie's matter-of-fact demeanor. Anne was nervous, at least a bit, and she wanted to see a bit of anxiety in Jackie too, but it wasn't there. Jackie seemed calm and collected, not even a bit fazed by their reunion. She was relaxed, in a polo shirt and shorts, showing off what were still a stunning pair of legs, and she was still skimming the surface of things, as if they were meeting casually as mutual acquaintances at a party. She hadn't expected any apologies from Jackie, but she did feel she had the right to know why Jackie gave her up. Anne soon asked her directly about the circumstances of her birth. Jackie said she'd gotten pregnant on a boat in the San Diego Bay. She hid in Los Angeles at a friend's house from the time she found out about the baby until her birth. Her diet, while she was there hiding her pregnancy, consisted mainly of hot dogs. It was 1965, and society wasn't as welcoming to unwed teen mothers back then as it is today. Anne's birth father showed up around a month before she was born. And, as it turns out, he did have an interest in being a father, as well as a husband, to Jackie. He offered to marry her and raise their baby together, but Jackie wasn't interested and turned him down. The baby came due a month later, and Jackie carried on with the adoption. The next day, Anne's birth father showed up at the hospital with friends to visit Jackie. Anne thought her story was odd, but Jackie didn't seem to think so. And Jackie offered no more details about the actual day of her birth, her delivery, or the adoption, at all. She said she didn't remember much about it. And then, Jackie began to tell her about her golden boy, Scott. There was a visible change in Jackie, just mentioning him. Her voice softened, and her eyes went all dreamy, as she described her youngest son. She talked about his older brother John and her life with Lee as well, but she continued to come back to Scott. She called him her golden boy and gushed about what an incredible baby he was. He was so quiet and well-behaved. She said they'd actually nearly left Scott in a restaurant, sometime as an infant, because they'd forgotten he was there with them. They gathered their coats and left the table, with Scott still strapped into his high chair. Their waiter had to run after her. He was yelling, "Ma'am, you left your baby." Jackie laughed and remarked about how unforgettable that day was for her. Then, Jackie tells the dark tale of her father's murder. John Latham went missing, just a day or two before Christmas. Some reports have him failing to return to his family on the 21st, but Jackie said the 23rd was the evening he never came home from work in his tire shop. Her mother Helen was frantic and called police that night. Jackie said John's body was found on Christmas Eve, under the Coronado Bridge. Though it seems, the massive bridge connecting San Diego with Coronado Island wasn't constructed until 1968, more than 20 years after John's homicide. And other reports state that his body was found on the 22nd, not Christmas Eve. If anyone has any information on the bridge, the conflicting dates, or the location where John's body was recovered, please post in the comments. Other details about his murder stay fairly consistent. John was certainly bludgeoned to death, and the murder weapon was found not far from his body, a rusted piece of pipe. All sources, including Jackie, also agreed that her mother Helen had a nervous breakdown, sending Jackie and her 3 brothers to a Catholic orphanage for nearly a decade. Jackie reunited with her mother, but by then, Helen was very ill. Jackie was her main caregiver, and her mother's health only got worse throughout Jackie's teens. She can remember her mother calling to her every time she would open her bedroom door. Helen would say, "Is that you, Jacqueline?" She always responded, "Yes, Mother, it's me." For years after her mother's passing, every time she would open a door, she would hear her mother asking for her. "Is that you, Jacqueline?" And have to fight the urge to answer, "Yes, Mother, it's me," knowing there was no one there. Then, Jackie suddenly smiled sadly. And she said, "Those nuns never talked to me about sex. I was very naive." This is as close as Jackie ever came to an explanation about the circumstances surrounding her 3 unwed pregnancies and the adoptions of Anne and Don. As they drove back to Point Loma, Don asked Anne what she thought of Jackie. As she replayed Jackie's tragic childhood in her mind, all she could think to say was, "I liked her. But she sure didn't have an easy life." Don and Anne continued to bond and build a relationship through their letters over the following weeks and months, and she would keep in touch with Jackie over the phone. As they spoke a few more times, their conversations became more comfortable and familiar. There were fewer awkward silences, but they never broached deep discussions. They would stick to safer topics, like recipes or the weather. But Anne didn't mind. She was glad to have found Jackie and looked forward to their chats. She was glad to have her in her life, and felt fortunate that she, and Lee, and Don, were all wonderful people. She knew that some reunions with birth parents were disastrous, and she felt lucky that hers seemed to be a success story. Though there may have been some apprehension at first, she and Jackie began to build a relationship. And when Anne told Jackie she had plans to move back to San Francisco, Jackie begged her to stop at Morro Bay to meet her golden boy, Scott. Jackie and Lee owned a beautiful home on the coast, in Morro Bay. When she arrived, they hugged hello, and Lee got her a glass of wine. Scott was still on his way over, so Lee gave her a tour of the house. There were views of the water from nearly every window, and their home was furnished with gorgeous furniture. Jackie owned an antique shop in town, and her home contained some of her most impressive finds. While Jackie displayed her detailed curio cabinets, ornate lamps, and elegant tables, Lee had a collection he was very proud of as well. Lee was a big fan of the Old West, and he kept a room full of artifacts and decor. He had a poker table, set up with antique playing cards fanned out at each seat, and an old tin shot glass for each player at the table. The centerpiece was an antique whiskey bottle. Even the light fixtures lent to the feel of a Western movie set. Lee even had an authentic Civil War uniform on display. Soon after her tour of the Petersons' house concluded, she saw Scott pull into the driveway. Even at a distance, Anne began to notice her resemblance to Scott. He had the same round face, and Jackie's eyes, that they shared, and they were framed by the same unruly thick eyebrows she'd wrestled to keep trimmed. She said it was an eerie feeling watching him walk toward the house that day, seeing that he'd looked so much like her. He came in the house smiling, and she could see right away that he'd gotten that from Jackie too. That same movie star smile that Don noticed she shared with Jackie the first day they'd met. Anne could see instantly why Scott was the golden boy. He was tall, tan, and athletic. His teeth were bright white and perfect. And he literally had a glow to his skin. She said he could have been the poster boy for Southern California. They enjoyed dinner together, and soon, she was so comfortable with the Petersons, she felt like they had been family forever. And as far as Scott Peterson goes, she said he lit up the room. And of course, like everyone else you could ever ask, she said he was charming. She liked him immediately, and said he was about as solid and genuine as you could get. She felt an instant familial connection, with Scott especially, but she said the whole family were decent, loving people, with good values. The next day, Jackie took her to her antique shop in town. When a customer came in and Jackie introduced Anne as her daughter, she was taken aback. When Jackie's customer left the store, Anne told her the situation had made her feel awkward. Anne had a mother in Point Loma. Her name was Jerry, and in Anne's mind she was not only perfect, but singular and irreplaceable. She knew Don had been happy to start calling Jackie Mom the moment they had met, and that was fine for Don. But she wasn't comfortable calling Jackie Mom, and apparently, she wasn't comfortable being introduced as Jackie's daughter either. Anne let Jackie know that it wasn't meant to be hurtful, but she'd prefer to call her something other than Mom. She playfully offered up Fairy Godmother as an alternative, and Jackie agreed with a smile. Fairy Godmother is perfect, she said. And you'll be my fairy goddaughter. At this point, Scott and Lacey's wedding was fast approaching, and Lacey was busy as ever with the planning. Lacey hadn't met Scott's long-lost sister yet, but it seemed like her relationships with Jackie, Scott, and Lee, the Petersons she had met so far, were going wonderfully. That is until the topic of Lacey and Scott's wedding came up. This is where we get a vastly different picture of Anne and Jackie's relationship, painted by Lacey herself. Over the summer, Jackie called Anne to tell her she wasn't invited to Lacey and Scott's wedding. Jackie told her that she very much wanted her to go, but Lacey hadn't felt comfortable inviting her, having never even met her before. Anne said she graciously accepted and respected Lacey's decision, and that honestly, she probably wouldn't have gone anyway. Saying she was emotionally unprepared to meet so many new family members all at once. She even said Scott called her about the wedding invite a couple of days later, apologizing for not inviting her, but hoping she could understand why. Again, and said she graciously reassured Scott that there was no reason to apologize. But, here's the thing. Lacey did invite Anne to her wedding. She invited her, and she not only told her mother Sharon about inviting her, but she told her about the nasty response she'd gotten to the invitation as well. Lacey said that Anne declined the invitation, not because she felt uncomfortable around all of the new family that would be there, but because she didn't want anything to do with Jackie or her family. It's not clear how Lacey invited Anne. They had never met in person, so we don't know if they spoke on the phone or if Scott or Jackie were meant to carry the message. In much the same way, we don't know how Lacey heard about the nasty response, about wanting nothing to do with the Petersons. We don't know if she said it directly to Lacey, or if it came from Scott or Jackie. But we do know that Sharon Rocha, Lacey's mother, has stated very clearly that this is what Lacey told her directly. She said Anne was definitely invited to Scott and Lacey's wedding, just as Don Chapman and his family had been invited just a month or two before Anne came into the picture, and she said that she had flatly refused to go, not wanting anything to do with Jackie Peterson or her family. Make of that what you will, but Jackie's long-lost daughter and Scott's long-lost sister will come back into our story. She's had quite a bit to say about the Petersons since then, but for now, we'll just put a pin in this and see how things shake out with Anne and Scott in the future. Lacey didn't let the Peterson family drama interfere with her wedding plans too much, but she was pretty upset with the sudden appearance of Don and Anne. Her frustration didn't have anything to do with who was invited, or who would rather not attend their wedding. It had everything to do with Jackie Peterson. The revelation of Jackie's illegitimate children, and the decades-long secret she kept about them, caused Lacey to lose quite a bit of respect for Jackie. For Lacey, it wasn't Jackie's potentially questionable lifestyle before they met that gave her pause, it was her lifestyle after. You see, since meeting Scott's mother, Jackie, Lacey had an impression of her future mother-in-law that was in violent contrast to the life Jackie had actually led. Lacey had only ever known Jackie to be a proper lady. Jackie had always portrayed an image of a prim, proper, sophisticated, and virtuous woman. She also believed Jackie to be very honest and genuine. While Lacey didn't judge her mistakes or decisions that led to her adopting out 2 of her children, and nearly adopting out a third, she did judge her for covering it up for 30 years, and putting on a face of honest virtue all the while. Lacey felt like the Jackie she knew wasn't real. She was disappointed and lost some trust for her when she realized Jackie was living the life of someone she wasn't. Lacey was always true to herself, and she valued that virtue in others as well. Lacey was never apologetic for being Lacey. She was silly when she wanted to be, not only when it was proper, and she always tried to speak up when it was necessary, not just when it was popular. So, she didn't shame Jackie for her past or her morals, she was only frustrated that Jackie never owned it. Until she was forced to, when it showed up on her doorstep, 30 years later. Knowing the gravity of a secret so large, and what it would take to keep it from everyone in the family, for so many years, must have been unsettling for Lacey as well. If Jackie could keep that from her sons Scott and John, and possibly even Lee, her husband of 25 years, what other secrets might she be keeping? Lacey had spent quite a bit of time with Jackie over the past 2 years. She and Scott never lived far from his parents while they attended Cal Poly, and it wasn't abnormal for them to see the Petersons multiple times a week. Scott and Lacey did their laundry there, and Lacey planted Jackie's garden for her in the spring, probably because Jackie's health kept her from doing it herself, and because Lacey was a sweetheart and nuts for flowers. But they also spent a lot of personal time together, whether it was antique shopping or tagging along on their annual family excursions, especially when Jackie's health got worse on these trips. While Scott and Lee would find the nearest golf course and disappear for the day, Lacey and Jackie would find themselves paired for the day. And because Jackie couldn't walk far to tour the shops or the gardens without getting too winded, the two would find themselves sitting together for brunch or tea, and maybe strolling to sit on the terrace of whatever little inn or motel they might be staying in. Lacey thought of Jackie as a friend, and she thought she'd known her fairly well. Just weeks before she was set to marry Scott and take their family name, Jackie's secrets left Lacey a little shaken. But Lacey wouldn't be a Peterson long before she began holding on to some dark and hurtful family secrets of her own. But for now, Lacey began making her plans for her last big hurrah as a Rocha. She and her girlfriends put together a bridal shower and bachelorette party, while Scott gathered his guy pals for a bachelor's trip to Lake Tahoe, where they gambled and golfed for the weekend. Lacey's mom joked later that the guys' party was far tamer than the girls'. By the 8th of August, Miss Lacey Rocha had every detail in place to become Mrs. Lacey Peterson during her dream garden wedding the next day. The family gathered for the rehearsal dinner, but her father Dennis never showed. Late that night, her mom got a call in her room at the Sycamore Mineral Springs Resort, where the wedding was being held the next afternoon. It was Lacey. She was sobbing so hard, she was unintelligible. After a minute or two, Sharon calmed Lacey down enough to understand what she was trying to tell her, but hearing her words clearly didn't help her mother make sense of the conversation much. She wasn't upset over her dad missing the rehearsal, or having pre-wedding jitters, as her mother suspected she was about to hear. Instead, Lacey told her she was upset over having to give up her maiden name of Rocha. Lacey was a Rocha, because her father was a Rocha obviously, and her roots on that side of the family were Portuguese. They were also old, proud, and strong, but Sharon still couldn't imagine her being this upset over her last name. Sharon was surprised and confused at the level of emotion Lacey was experiencing, over something she'd never mentioned being concerned about before then. She'd offered the solution of hyphenating her name, going by Lacey Rocha Peterson, but the idea didn't appeal to Lacey, and she brushed it off. Then, Sharon got a strange feeling while on the phone with her daughter that made her ask, "Is Scott in the room with you?" When Lacey answered that yes, Scott was right next to her. Sharon got the feeling her daughter might not be willing, or able, to tell her what she was really so distraught over. Lacey eventually calmed down, and her wedding to Scott the next day went on as planned, although not entirely without a little drama and stress, but Sharon Rocha would look back on this strange conversation with her daughter, just hours before her marriage to Scott Peterson, and always wonder if there was more Lacey wanted, and needed to tell her, during that midnight phone call. And, if she had, would it have changed their nightmarish future? Lacey walked down the aisle to Scott, arm in arm with her father Dennis, and her grandfather, who she lovingly referred to as Papa. And while she had been highly frustrated with Dennis just a short time before, her mother, Sharon, cried as she watched her little girl given away by the two most important men in her life. She had her father and her grandfather share the honor, but it nearly ended up being her Papa alone. Dennis still hadn't shown up, and it was nearly time for the ceremony to begin. His absence had Sharon rather irritated, even more so because he had also missed the rehearsal dinner the night before. But Lacey kept her cool, and Dennis finally made his appearance, not long before the ceremony was set to start. The only issue was his tux. Dennis didn't have one. And though he had tried to borrow a suit from his stepson, it was tiny. Lacey wasn't about to let him walk her down the aisle in a suit that was 3 sizes too small. She said he looked ridiculous. Luckily for Lacey, and even more so for Dennis, the wedding planner stepped in to save the day. She called the local tux shop, convinced them to open early, and do an emergency fitting for Dennis. He was back and ready, in the nick of time, to walk his little girl down the aisle and give her away to Scott Peterson. As Lacey walked along the pink and white rose petals, her father on one side, and her papa on the other, the drama of the day had melted away completely. Scott and Lacey handed Sharon and Jackie each a single long-stemmed rose. Her family, especially her mother Sharon, watched Lacey with watery eyes as Dennis carefully moved a strand of her hair from her face, before placing his little girl's hand into the hand of her new husband. A symbol of his passing along the trust and care of his precious daughter, from his own hands, into Scott's. Even though the procession got off to a stressful start, Lacey's dream wedding had come together beautifully. The newly pronounced Mr. and Mrs. Peterson presented quite beautifully as well. Their perfect smiles conveyed the purest joy to all of those who knew them best and loved them most. Lacey was a vision in her pearl-strewn wedding gown, and Scott cut a fine figure by her side. His beaming smile shone brightly through his dark, intense eyes. Lacey was overjoyed with her wedding, in the lush summer gardens, to the perfect man. Taco Bell played, and the champagne and happy tears flowed. Lacey's storybook romance, with her charming prince, was the object of admiration and envy. For Lacey, their wedding was just the beginning of the fairy tale. And then came the reception, and Lee Peterson's awkward toast to the bride and groom. It was actually a bit of advice he'd gotten when he was young from his own father, apparently. And it went something like this. "Son, when you marry a girl, Make sure she's beautiful, you're going to have to look at her the rest of your life. Scott's done that. That's about all. God bless you kids. Scott gave a toast as well, and in it, he thanked Sharon and Dennis for giving him the one thing that had brought him true happiness. His new wife, Lacey. The beautiful young newlyweds honeymooned in Tahiti, where Lacey surprised herself by visiting a topless beach. By the time they returned to San Luis Obispo after all of the wedding and honeymoon excitement, Lacey only had a few months left until graduation, and they had already started to make some real plans for their life together after. Their intention was to stay near the coast, but get a little closer to the Bay Area and a larger city. They discussed moving together to somewhere near San Francisco, or maybe even San Jose, after they both graduated Cal Poly. Lacey, however, graduated before Scott, and by the beginning of 1998, she not only had her degree, but a job offer as well. The position was for a wine distributor in Prunedale, not too far south of San Jose, and it was a good job, but it was 2 hours away from Cal Poly, and Scott wouldn't be graduating until the following summer. After discussing their options, they both agreed that Lacey should take the job and move to Prunedale, without Scott. Even though it wasn't an ideal situation for the newlyweds, they both also agreed that it would only be temporary, until Scott graduated, and he would join her there. And so Lacey took their golden retriever, Mackenzie, and moved into a mobile home, 2 hours away from her new husband, to start her new job in Prunedale. She would visit Scott on the Cal Poly campus nearly every weekend, and every chance she could get during the week. He had moved out of their little treehouse in the country, and into a large house with several bedrooms, with some other guys as roommates. It seems, though, that soon after she left, or maybe even before she'd gone, that Scott added some extracurricular activities into his coursework at Cal Poly, and it wasn't long before Lacey discovered what he'd been up to. Rob, Juan, and Nando lived with Scott in the house they shared near the Cal Poly campus during his senior year. One day, they were alarmed to hear a woman screaming just outside of Scott's bedroom door. The woman's name was Janet, and by the time Nando walked her to her car, she was even more furious. She began yelling, now at Nando, saying, "I can't believe he's cheating on me." The woman was Janet Isle, and she was Scott's girlfriend. They'd been together for several months by then. And this would be the beginning of the dark secret Lacey carried with her, about her perfectly charming husband. You see, Janet thought Scott was cheating on her with Lacey. As she stood by her car, screaming furiously at Nando about Scott being unfaithful to her, Nando stopped her and explained. The woman Janet had just seen, in her boyfriend's bed, was his wife. Nando told her he understood why she was so shocked. None of the roommates had any idea Scott was married either, that is, not until Lacey called the house for Scott one day and announced herself as his wife. Janet could hardly believe it. She and Scott had been together for months, and they spent more time together than they did apart. Her friend Tracy even dated one of his housemates, and they would often go out on double dates. Recently, Scott had even begun talking to her about moving in together. How she could have possibly missed the fact that he was married had her speechless. She left Nando that day, and likely thought back on her relationship with Scott. Janet was a sophomore, and 6 years younger than him. She described him as romantic, thoughtful, generous, and consistently flattering. Scott was always dropping by with food and little gifts for her and her roommates. She even recalled meeting his dog, Mackenzie. When they first started dating, he bought her 12 dozen roses. That's right, he gave her 144 roses. And the roses from Scott will come up again in the series, so don't forget to subscribe, so you can be the first to know who he gives them to next. He also gave Janet several gifts, and planned expensive dinners at fine restaurants for the two of them. Oddly, when Janet told him she was a vegetarian, he said he stopped eating meat soon afterward. But Janet later said herself, she thought Scott had to be too good to be true. She also said he came on too strong in the beginning, and she had to ask him to slow things down when he suggested a long vacation together. He told her he wanted to take her on a days-long trip to Mexico, but Janet turned him down. But that had been early on, and months of dating had gone on since. By then, Janet did think that they were somewhat serious, particularly after their discussions about getting a place together. At the very least, Janet certainly thought that they were exclusive to one another. Hence her screaming at Scott when she saw another woman in his bed. Scott's reaction, however, was a whole other story. That night, Janet had gone to Scott's place to surprise him with an unannounced late-night visit. And when his long-term girlfriend walked in on him, in bed with his wife, and started screaming at him about being a liar and a cheat, Scott didn't really react at all. His expression stayed calm and flat. He didn't say a word, not to Janet, not to Lacey. He didn't try to explain or defend himself. He just stared at her blankly, in silence, until Nando heard her screaming at him, and gathered her away from his door. And Lacey's reaction appears to have been to hold it in, and to keep her husband's dark secrets to herself. She and Scott never split or showed any outward sign of any issues with their relationship. Not during this, or any other time while they were together. Except for a rare bit of anger Sharon saw from Lacey, on a visit to Prunedale early that year. Lacey was frustrated with Scott not answering her calls, and not returning her messages. She told her mother angrily that Scott seemed to have recently forgotten that he had a wife. Lacey said he moved into that house full of boys, and began to think he was single again. Lacey said she would have to put him straight. This was the first, and maybe the only time, she had ever seen anything near serious anger or frustration from Lacey towards Scott. They were as happy and in love as they'd ever been, as far as anyone could tell. Lacey never complained about Scott to her mother or her girlfriends. And she never told anyone about Janet. Unfortunately, it seems, Lacey's happily ever after got off to a rather rocky start. Although you might not know it to look at them, Lacey and Scott certainly had their issues. They must have been mounting at this point, because soon after Lacey caught him with Janet, or should we say, Janet caught him with Lacey, he graduated from Cal Poly, and told Lacey that he changed his mind about moving in with her in Prunedale. In our next episode, we'll discover how Lacey reacts to this, and some other shocking confessions from Scott, as she tries to continue building their fairy tale life together. And we'll see Lacey celebrate the most exciting part of their future together, her pregnancy, with Scott's baby. Don't miss our next episode. Subscribe now to hear the details in Part 5, about Scott and Lacey's business venture together, and Lacey's diary entries, as she and Scott were preparing to start their family together. Hit the bell to get notifications, and tap the like button if you liked the episode. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, stay safe, be kind, memento mori, and happy Thanksgiving.